Ken, it's great to see you today.
Thank you very much for hosting me on Kyiv Post, Jason. I'm glad to be back on your program.
So, Ken, you're a psychiatrist who's spent a number of years studying foreign figures, including such figures as Vladimir Putin. You spent a number of years in Moscow, and during that period of time, you also studied Putin. So, what was your take on who he is back then? How did you end up in Russia to begin with?
I got to Russia because prior to my government service, when I was an academic psychiatrist in the 90s, I had worked and collaborated with the late Dr. Gerald Post, who was really a legendary psychiatrist who founded the discipline of leadership psychology and leadership profiling at CIA from the mid 60s till the mid 80s, and then continued this work as an academic scholar at George Washington University until he died a couple of years ago. I was fortunate to meet with Dr. Post in the mid 90s, where we began a friendship and collaboration studying war criminals, profiling Dr. Radovan Karadzic and the late Slobodan Milosevic, because I'm fluent in Bosnian and Serbian. So this began a collaboration where we presented this type of work. When I was, so meeting him really changed my life professionally. And I applied to the State Department and was fortunate to be hired as a regional psychiatrist. Our jobs were to take care of all of the people under Chief of Mission Authority in a given region. So my post was Moscow. So I was the first psychiatrist sent there because after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s, they'd opened up all these new embassies, including the US Embassy in Kyiv. I've been to Kyiv about 15 times for work. So this was the major part of my job, was taking care of people. But I continued to keep up my interest in leadership analysis and profiling, and had studied Vladimir Putin very closely when he came to power. I had read First Person, his autobiography, when it was translated into English in, I think, early 2000, right after he was elected president in the spring of 2000. And I found it fascinating, and I kept up with President Putin's career throughout the years.
So, you have kept up with him, but what have you seen change? Back in 2000, do you think he's the same guy that he is today?
Yes, in one sense, he's the same person. He's a very extraordinarily skilled KGB officer. He would agree with that statement. He's a Chekist by training and a Chekist at heart. He has very exceptional political and diplomatic skills. He's been in power now for 25 years. He has impressive language skills. His German, this was shown in, I believe, 2000 or 2001, when he gave a marvelous speech to the Bundestag, uh, where he talked about how Russia was a part of Europe and how the cultures of Europe and Germany were linked with that of Russia. This speech is really worth watching for any of your listeners on this program. That's what's changed, is his language. The person inside hasn't changed. He's a rational but ruthless, highly intelligent political leader. And he's amazingly resilient. Those things haven't changed. But if you look at his language, that's changed. If you look at the speech to the Bundestag in the early 2000s, and you look at the speech where he launched the current iteration of the war against Ukraine in February of 2022, that's a speech full of jingoistic hatred that launched what has become a genocidal war. Those speeches are 180 degrees apart. So the use of language has changed.
So let's continue on with that. Why has it changed? What does it usually indicate?
I think it changed because Putin's political objectives have changed. I think early on in his career, Putin saw himself as collaborating with the West. We certainly saw this after 9/11, when he aligned with the United States and with then President George Bush in this fight against global terror. And Putin was actually the first foreign leader to call President Bush after 9/11, after the tragedy of 9/11. So I think that sort of shifted his relationship in a different way. But what has changed, I think the changes started to happen around 2006, 2007, after a spate of color revolutions. Putin kind of withdrew, turned more inward, turned eastward, if you will, away from the West, and this certainly came out in his famous speech at the 2007 Munich Security Conference. But one of the things you have openly quoted that President Putin said during that time to people such as then Ambassador Bill Burns or even to President Bush was that Ukraine's not a real country. So I think those thoughts were already in President Putin's psyche. What's different is that he acted on them very decisively, not only in 2014 when they first invaded Ukraine and took Crimea and parts of the Donbass, but more definitively in February of 2022. So the willingness to use aggression and attack a nation, although this had happened in Georgia in 2008, Georgia was a very short skirmish by comparison. This is a brutal war which has led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people on both sides and the displacement of 8 or more million Ukrainian citizens who have had to leave Ukraine.
So, if you were looking at Vladimir Putin today, and you were the White House, looking at the negotiations going forward, how should you approach them? What is Putin looking for? How do you make a persuasive argument to Putin? And at the same time, if you're the Ukrainians, how should they be looking at this?
Let me start with the first part. Negotiating with Putin is extremely challenging and difficult. He drives a hard maximalist bargain, as we've seen. And Putin, to borrow a phrase that President Trump used in that ill-fated meeting over a week and a half ago with President Zelensky in the Oval Office, Putin believes he has all the cards, and he believes he's winning, and he's playing a long game that he can wear the West down, he can wear America down, he can wear the Ukrainians down, that he can achieve his long-term goals. His resilience is really remarkable. His political and personal resilience is not something to be trifled with. So I think he believes in his maximalist goals, and the people around him share those beliefs, his inner circle, and now much of Russia. And I don't believe that's just because of propaganda. I think people genuinely believe that. But the challenge, and Putin has shown he can be negotiated with. If you look at the hostage releases last August, where journalists such as Evan Gershwin, Alma Kurmasheva, and also the American citizen Paul Whelan were released in a trade for several SVR illegals and a convicted FSB assassin, Vadim Krasnikov, who had killed a Chechen in broad daylight in Germany. Putin has shown he can be negotiated with, but it's always on his terms. He negotiates from strength. So negotiating with Putin demands the equal understanding that he only respects strength and he respects reciprocity. The other fallacy that I think people get into is people talk in the media and the think tank space about finding pain points with Putin. I've got bad news for your listeners. Putin doesn't have any pain points. Sanctions, further sanctions, things like that don't work. I think enticements might work. And in a sense, that's what I think President Trump did, something bold and unexpected by welcoming Putin, saying we want to find a pathway back for Russia to be part of the G8. We want to welcome Russia back into the family of civilized nation. That's important to President Putin. Respect on the world stage is a enticement point that has real valence and meaning for him. But unfortunately, Putin doesn't respond well to threats. People that think he does or that Russians do haven't lived in Russia and they've never met a real Russian.
That's very interesting. Now, some people say that the US President Donald Trump, perhaps he's offering this to Russia not out of strategic significance, but simply because he likes Vladimir Putin. He seems to like the tough guy, the mafioso image. What do you think about that? Is that what drives Trump's true interest in Putin?
I think that line of thinking, which is very common in the media and even in think tank writings, is probably overplayed and slightly mistaken. I think President Trump, who came from a background of the very rough and tumble world of commercial real estate in New York City, respects negotiators who are tough, who are strong. That kind of respect and skill set allowed people like President Trump and one of his top negotiators, Special Envoy Stephen Witkoff, who also hails from that world, to succeed in that world. So I think that's part of President Trump's uh, style that's important. But I think it's still, even for experienced negotiators such as President Trump or Steve Witkoff, um, when they're up against President Putin, it's like playing the Yankees. You have to be they're very good. The opponent is very, very worthy and very dangerous. So I think one has to be careful about that. The other thing that was fascinating about the initial negotiations in Riyadh was the presence of, it's both fascinating and ironic, the presence of Kirill Dmitriev, who is the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund. This guy is a brilliant investment banker. He's young, so he represents the new face of Russia, post-Putin Russia, if you will. He's very close to President Putin, to President Putin's family. He's in a sense managing the sovereign wealth fund, which is almost, you could argue, like a family office of Putin. A Putin family office could be another name for it. And guess who trained this guy and helped him? We did. He went to Stanford, where he graduated at the age of 19. Then he went to Harvard Business School. Then he worked for a hedge fund for several years, set up by Drexel Private Equity. That hedge fund became later the what is now the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and it was funded by the U.S. Russia Foundation in its early days. So we trained and incentivized and funded now one of President Putin's top negotiators. The irony is just unbelievable.
That is very ironic. Now, if you're Vladimir Putin and you see all the statements are being made by Donald Trump, which seem to be much more favorable to Russia than they are to Ukraine, and with the recent scandal in the West Wing, in the Oval Office, between President Trump, Vice President Vance, and President Zelensky, how do you think that Putin is analyzing all this? What does he see?
What he sees is initially he has an advantage. He's going to see that as squabbling. And Putin has written in his book and in his speeches a proverb that every Russian knows: which means we don't take our trash out of our house. We don't hang our dirty laundry out in the eyes of the world. And I wish that meeting had happened in private. It was most unfortunate. But Putin is going to see this type of squabbling as a sign of weakness that can be exploited. The other thing that President Trump has done in the negotiations is he has given more up front than most people would typically do in negotiating with a hardball negotiator such as President Putin, by offering conditions and signals, if you will, that we are willing to do these things. Some of those signals I think are positive, but some of them perhaps could have been leveraged more by President Trump and weighted. My guess is that what President Trump is doing, and this gets back to your earlier question, President Trump prides himself on his instincts as a negotiator, as a leader. And his instincts may be correct, but it's a very high risk, high reward type of negotiation. We all want President Trump to succeed and bring peace to Ukraine. But if he fails, then the security architecture that has kind of been disrupted by these negotiations, kind of a reverse Kissinger that he's trying to do, then creates more long-term strategic risk vis-a-vis Europe, the United States, and other countries. The other irony about these negotiations, if you look at Kissinger's negotiations, the opening to China in 1971, they happened in the utmost secrecy. They were very covert. These negotiations are happening in public eye, in social media space, with all parties signaling their wants and desires. This includes the Ukrainian government, the Russians, the United States, and the Europeans. So it 30 years from now, when historians write about this, they're going to note how these negotiations had multiple levels in that regard. That's also very interesting. I think the Ukrainians, to get to your other question, have to be very careful, because one of the risks that has happened with President Zelensky, and I think he's wisely corrected that with his recent statements, public statements, and his going to Riyadh this week to meet with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has been, after that ill-fated White House meeting, rather than Putin being seen as the thorn in the side and an impedance to successful negotiations for peace in the Ukraine, that role shifted to Zelensky being seen as the impediment. That's not a role President Zelensky wants to be in, nor should he be in. And it's a victory for Putin of sorts, a very disappointing victory, but still a victory for President Putin.
So in the case of Ukraine, if you're President Zelensky, how should he be approaching Donald Trump now? What's Trump looking for?
I think by now President Trump is well known to world leaders, having served in a prior term and having been a public figure. I think you know, a certain amount of decorum and deference. I'll give an example with that Oval Office meeting. President Zelensky speaks excellent English, but he should have used an interpreter. There were little nuances that he got wrong. That also buys him time. You and I know this from having met people that work in these diplomatic spaces. Even when they all speak perfect English, they use an interpreter because it buys you time to think about your answer. I think President Zelensky should wear a suit when he goes to these meetings. I'm not saying this in the cheeky way that's been said on social media, but it sends a message, a psychological message, to all the other negotiating parties, including Presidents Trump and Putin, that I'm shifting from being a courageous, heroic wartime leader to a peacetime leader. So wear a suit with a blue and yellow tie. But that sends a different kind of message. And I think the other mistake that was made is this type of negotiation where you have leaders out front, that should be done in private, because the egos of all these leaders, they're all human beings, they all have big egos, come into play. And again, ill-chosen words. Calling Vice President Vance JD was highly inappropriate. So those kind of mistakes should be corrected, and hopefully President Zelensky will make these corrections with his negotiating team, and they can move forward. And I think all the signs that we're seeing now is that process is happening, and that will appeal to President Trump and what he wants to do vis-a-vis peace in Ukraine.
So you've mentioned you've studied war criminals before. Let me ask you a question about that. As you know, there's been a lot of war crimes committed in Ukraine. But
Yes.
not specifically speaking about Ukraine, but as a whole, what's the profile of somebody who goes to the war and just creates atrocities, creates crimes against humanity?
When Dr. Post and I studied Dr. Radovan Karadzic, who was the then leader of the Bosnian Serbs in the mid-90s, and then in the late 90s, the late president of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, can war criminals be negotiated with? Yes, they were negotiated with in Dayton, and again by the late Bakhti Ahtisaari after Kosovo, when there were negotiations with Milosevic. These people have, like all politicians, these words aren't that helpful. Yes, they're all narcissistic, they have tremendous egos, but once you cross the line and commit or do or support war crimes, that puts you in a different, more difficult category. And that's, I think that's really a sticky point for the Ukrainian leadership, not just President Zelensky, but those around him, which I try to imagine, if there's a successful peace agreement and a signing ceremony, it will be very difficult, I suspect, for President Zelensky to shake President Putin's hand. I think because of the losses and the nature of the tragedies, if you look at Buchna and other war crimes, the kidnapping of children, uh, some sort of mechanism will have to be found in the negotiations for them to have a long-term uh, agreement of resolving those issues. I don't know what the answer is. I'm afraid it may look a lot like Dayton 2.0, where the killing stops, but the hatreds remain.
Again, that's really fascinating. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you for hosting me. It's always a pleasure to be on your show.